So, I wanted to make a little video to tell you how the fair forces of Bretonnia fared at the Triple Crown Grand Tournament. Did we rise to the occasion or sink humiliatingly beneath the waves? Let's find out. So my list for the 5 games of this Grand Tournament is exactly the same as the one that featured against Mark in the battle report I uploaded around a fortnight ago. So it is, for core, 9 Knights of the Realm with full command and the Banner of Swiftness, those are the Red Knights. 12 Knights Errant with full command and the Erranti Banner, those are the Blue Knights. Next I've got 6 Knights Errant with the Champion, those are the guys in white, and finally 10 Skirmishing Peasant Bowmen. For special I've got 5 Mounted Yeomen with spears and bows. For rare, 2 Field Trebuchets, 2 Unicorns from the Storm of Magic supplement, and 9 Grail Knights with the Musician, those are the chaps in green and yellow. For Lords, my general is Chantel the Prophetess, who is there in the white dress with a Power Stone. Then I've got the Green Knight, hoping he puts up a rather better performance than he did against Mark and actually turns up. For heroes, we've got loads of them. First we've got Marie, the lady in a yellow dress, riding a horse. Then we've got 4 Paladins, Jacques riding his trusty Royal Pegasus with the Worm Lance, a Charmed Shield and the Dragonbane Gem. Then we've got 3 on horses, Pierre, my gallant battle standard bearer, wielding a lance, a shield and wearing the Grummel Greathelm. We've then got Michel, who has an enchanted shield and the Dawnstone. And then finally Gaston, who has a dragon helm and a luck stone. This list works out at +5 on the Triple Crown comp pack, which gives you positive points for picking things that are reckoned to be softer and negative points for picking things that are reckoned to be harder. At +5, this is a pretty soft list, and so I'm going to be matched against another list that's +5 in my first round and hopefully receive a little bit of a bump to my overall finishing place come the end of 5 rounds. Now, I'm fairly optimistic of doing quite well with this list. I took a Bretonnian list, admittedly a different one, to the Cardiff tournament last year, which had around 60 something players in it, and managed to come 5th. So I'm optimistic I may be able to surprise a few people, despite fielding one of the weakest armies in the game. Realistically, I know from experience that to get anywhere near the top 3 in a tournament like this, you've really got to win probably 4 of your games. Now, for scoring purposes, the Triple Crown used the 20-0 scoring system, which essentially rewards you for winning games by larger margins. To score the maximum 20 points, you really need to nearly wipe your opponent out without really losing very much of your own. In addition, because this is a tournament and we're doing several rounds in one day, the battles are pretty hard limited to 2 hours and 15 minutes, which usually means 4 turns or if you're lucky, 5 turns. This means, realistically, you have to take a few more risks than you would if you knew you were going to get all 6 turns in order to go for those big wins. This is something that I suspect works rather heavily to the disadvantage of Bretonnia, because sometimes, as Bretonnian players will know, there's not much you can do about a large, stubborn 50-strong infantry block. You're probably not going to be able to blow that away in 4 turns, so you're going to have to pick on the other things in the army and go for a skinny win. But in this tournament, given that I'm trying to do well, I can't really do that. I've got to go for gold. So, how did I do? Let's find out. Now, in my first round, I'm facing dwarves and playing an opponent that I've never faced before called Terra. Now, from experience, dwarves are not a bad matchup for Bretonnia. Obviously, organ guns are a big problem, but stone throwers, cannons, rather less of a concern, and generally speaking, with the infantry, it's possible to blow through them with your knights, unless of course the infantry block is stubborn. And the real problem with dwarves is of course if they have the Master Rune of Groth One Eye in the army, which makes units within 12 of the bearer stubborn. That's going to be a big problem if Terra has got that. Now, when I see his army going down, he castles up in one corner, which does lend suspicion to the theory that his BSB in the Longbeard unit on the table edge probably does have the Master Rune of Groth One Eye, and that unit is too big for me realistically to be able to wipe out. So I'm going to have to pick my targets. It's going to be very difficult for me to be able to run this army over and get a big win. This is doubly true because when Terra rolls for his ancestral grudge, he gets the one where his whole army hates my army. That being said, he's very dependent on shooting to score very many points himself, and while he does have some very good shooting, including some Iron Drakes and that Organ Gun, it's not as heavy as you would expect to find perhaps in a harder dwarf list. Now, quite quickly after this game begins, I realise that I've made my first mistake, which is to deploy my Knight of the Realm unit there in red on the left, which has of course the long bomb charge because it has virtue of the Impetuous Knight on one of the paladins too far away from the action and in front of his Iron Drakes. I should have really put it on the right hand side. My plan in this game is going to be to try to neutralise his war machines, especially his organ guns and those Iron Drakes, and then try and charge maybe that dwarf unit there on the left that's not covered by the Rune of Groth One Eye. That's realistically the best chance I have of winning this game while not losing very many points of my own. So I deploy outside of the maximum range of his organ gun, so I don't have to face that in the first turn. And his cannon and stone thrower aren't particularly problematic for me as Bretonnia because I don't really have any kind of sort of big targets that those specialise in taking off. So, what happened in this game in summary? Well, I think it was a bit of a cagey affair. I didn't really move up as much as perhaps I should have done. I was a bit too worried about his organ gun and his Iron Drakes. Now, I split up my paladins from the unit, as I did in the game against Mark, and I managed, using Michelle's virtue of the Impetuous Knight, to get a long bomb charge on his organ gun. With the Iron Drakes, I did manage to deal with them rather effectively, but it did cost me time. So what I did was I tried to charge Gaston into them, who I knew had the Dragon Helm. Terra elected to stand and shoot, and of course I had a 2-up ward against that. I was then in a position to charge those Iron Drakes off and destroy them with my Knight of the Realm unit in a subsequent turn. Where the game went a lot less well for me though was my Grail Knights. Terra more or less unloaded all of his available shooting at them, and he managed to wipe the whole unit out. This is of course annoying because had I even survived with one guy in my turn, I would have just been able to put him behind the tower and run away and deprive Terra of all those points. Another thing that really hamstrung me in this game was my Knight Errant in blue on the right hand side declared a charge because I failed my Impetuous test on his Thunderers, and the Thunderers' stand and shoot reaction killed 3 Knights Errant, and this was enough to panic me and make me flee. I did rally the unit later, but it was enough to neutralise them as a threat. So my Grail Knights were dead, my Knights Errant were fleeing, and my Knights of the Realm were off dicking around with some Iron Drakes. And so I didn't really have the kind of force I needed to prize out any of these powerful dwarf units. My Green Knight did come in later and spent some time fighting some crossbowmen and managed to win combats and win them handsomely, but the dwarves had the Master Rune of Groth One Eye and so were stubborn. So in the end, this game finished an 11-9 victory to me. I just about managed to pip over the 200 points more than my opponent. And overall, it was a tough game. It was a cagey affair, but I didn't really feel as though I got to grips properly with my opponent. I didn't really even get inside the outer gates of the castle, let alone bursting through it. And sure, he did have Master Rune of Groth One Eye, and I did think that he had that, but I was just a little bit too cautious. Nonetheless, not a disaster, a win, but really a very skinny one, and I'm going to have to do better than that moving into the next game. I should also say that Terra was a fantastic opponent to play, very sporting, very considerate, and I chatted with him again several times over the course of the tournament. So, on to my next game then, and I'm essentially really just in the middle tables against another opponent who has, also basically got a draw in his first game. So I'm hoping to try and win this one by a large margin to push me up to the upper tables. So my second round opponent is Barry, who is fielding a very interesting army, an all-goblin army no less, consisting of zillions of squigs, zillions of fanatics, zillions of goblins, really the works. This game actually was live streamed from the Triple Crown, and you can see that video on their Facebook page of the game live. Now, when I saw the goblins going down, I wasn't especially worried about them because obviously these are goblins. The infantry blocks are going to be very easy for me to break. Even if they are stubborn for some reason, I think I'm going to be able to kill so many of them that it doesn't matter very much. His general is Skarsnik, and I know that Skarsnik doesn't make his units stubborn, and so there's not really an obvious source of that there. So I think I can blow through this army with my knights. That being said, when I see this army go down, some doubts do begin to rise in my mind. The first is that he's got so many night goblins that he's probably going to have the full complement of 9 fanatics, which are obviously excellent against knights and can do things like block charges and get in the way. He's also got 4 war machines, which are all very threatening. 2 doom divers, which need no introduction as night killers, and then also 2 squig gobbers. I faced these in another game with my chaos, and they do sort of 3d6 armor piercing hits that just hit. And so these are also good at killing knights. They're also really good in combat as well. They're a bit of a weird unit. So the point here is that I'm going to have to clear out a lot of this knight killing detritus before I really let his main blocks have it. Now, he's got 2 mangler squigs in there, which are normally quite dangerous. I'm not worried about those because I've got the Green Knight and 2 unicorns, which are ideal for moving into them and dispatching him. So, his army goes down with the goblins behind the squigs. Now, unbeknownst to me, this is actually a rather classic goblin ploy. The enemy charges the squigs, but they come within 8 inches of the goblins, and so the fanatics get released. Sure, they go through the squigs, but you've got so many of them, you don't really care. With my own deployment, I didn't do anything fancy, just deployed my knights in the middle. This is also the scenario where we have King of the Hill, so if I can get a fortitude bearing unit on that hill at the end of the game, I'll be able to capture it. I think I've got a good chance of being able to do this, because his night goblins are the ones with fortitude and they're well behind his squigs. So I'm very happy to let him go first, and his army bounces up or moves up towards me, often with its random movement. Now in my turn 1, the Green Knight appears and moves into one of the mangler squigs, destroying it. I destroy the other mangler squig on the other side with one of my unicorns. This really was always going to happen, so at least I don't have them to worry about. The rest of my movement, I got to admit, I'm still a little bit cagey with because I'm worried about coming within 24 inches of those squig gobbers. Ideally, I'd like to destroy at least one of them with shooting and magic before I really advance forwards with my knights. I am able to do some damage on these in the magic phase and the shooting phase, but not to kill them. In Barry's turn 2, he continues to move up his stuff. The Snotling Pump Wagon, for example, careers forwards into a place where I'm able to charge it with the Yeoman and destroy it. He destroys one of his own Doom Divers in the shooting phase, which is excellent for me, and also I believe both of his Squig Gobbers misfire. Barry having very, very poor luck with his war machines, something that was to haunt him throughout the game. Now, where really this sort of turned was at something quite incidental, I think, which is that Jacques, my Pegasus riding paladin, I tried to charge into one of the damaged squig gobbers which had been hit earlier by my trebuchet. In doing so, I came within 8 inches of some of the night goblin blocks and triggered out 2 sets of fanatics, which literally went all over the place. Jacques himself was hit, but he wasn't killed. And this really, in a sense, blew one of Barry's main defences against me, because I'd sort of ridden in there with a single character and the fanatics had been released. This wasn't really part of my strategy, so I was a bit fortunate about this. Jacques also bailed me out later by trying to make another charge or manoeuvre after he had disposed of the Squig Gobber, which also drew out some fanatics from the Night Goblin unit that's behind the Squig herd on the left, which meant that my main Knight unit, with virtue of the Impetuous Knight, got a clear charge on them without any of the fanatics blocking their way, where they would have done 2d6 strength 5 hits to go through them, not something you want as a knight. Now, with these defences blown by a mixture of his own poor misfiring rolls, me destroying the Mangler Squigs and the Snotling Pump Wagon, and his fanatics kind of being perhaps rather incidentally smoked out by my Pegasus riding Paladin Jack, this was most of the main defences that Barry had kind of blown. And so in turn 3, I start making some serious charges on the Squig herds. Some of the Squig herds have already been damaged by shooting, and so I'm able to sweep them aside very easily and also get some overruns into some of the goblin blocks behind. This really doesn't at all go well for Barry. I'm able to get some good magic off that supports the serial massacre of these goblins and these squigs. By the end of this, I'm so dominant that really only Skarsnik's unit is left on the board edge. And after I let him have it with another charge, Barry, rather artistically and very sportingly, just decides to flee with Skarsnik's unit rather than seeing him being run over by a freight train, based on the rather fluffy description of that's what Skarsnik himself would do. He'd obviously run off the board rather than just get meekly slaughtered. So fairly self-evidently, this game is a very heavy victory for me. I almost lose nothing, and I've virtually tabled Barry. All he has left is a Warlord on a bouncing cave squig thingy by the end of the game. This is a 20-0 victory to me, and puts me on 31 points out of a possible 40 from my 2 games so far. Barry, also a very humorous opponent, took his absolutely diabolical luck with the misfire dice very much on the chin and with excellent good humour. There was also some luck from me here, I think, in how I used that Pegasus riding Paladin. It might have looked like skill, but in fact I was a lot less aware of the intricacies of these fanatic rules than perhaps I might have given the impression of, because I've not really faced fanatics that often before, because usually when you face orcs and goblins in a tournament setting, it's the orc gun line that you're facing, not a bunch of goblins with fanatics. So I'm feeling pretty good about things going into game 3. I know that if I can get a big win in this game, I am very much still competitive for this space in the top 3 that I'm trying to achieve with my Bretonnians. So the next game is against a player called Alex, who again I've not faced before, and he has a Lizardman army. Now, Lizardmen can be a bit tough for Bretonnians. The reason for this is because they always have a unit of Temple Guard with a slan in it, and that unit of Temple Guard is stubborn, and Lizardmen don't fail stubborn tests, or indeed psychology tests of most kinds, because they roll an extra dice and choose the lowest 2. So, this might be difficult to break. When I see his army going down and he explains what it does, I start to get a pretty bad feeling. Reason being because he's got a Temple Guard block, admittedly only 20 strong, with Lord Croak in it. Not faced Lord Croak before. What he does is make his whole unit unbreakable. Absolute nightmare for Bretonnians. They're also -1 to hit as well, which is also going to reduce the body count when I charge them myself. That unit's going to be a problem. He's then got a single ancient Stegodon. Stegodon's also stubborn, of course, but, you know, you can get through them with the right sort of charges. And I do have the Green Knight, who's obviously excellent against something that doesn't have high combat resolution and doesn't have magic attacks. He's then got a unit of, I believe, nearly 40 Saurus Warriors. Now, Saurus Warriors are, normally not a thing you're too afraid of going down if you're Bretonnians. But he's got Gorok in them, a special character who makes the unit stubborn. Oh dear. So 1 unbreakable unit and 1 stubborn unit are where all the points are. This is going to be difficult. Now, of course, if I kill Gorok, I can break their stubborn. But of course, Gorok, you can just about see him there with the sort of kind of white helmet on, is on the side of the Saurus unit, and it's going to be difficult to throw that many attacks against him. He's also got toughness 6 and a 2-up armor save as well. But really, trying to ping him off is, I think, where the game is going to be decided. I'm not optimistic that I'm going to be able to defeat Lord Croak's unit. But if I am able to destroy that Saurus block, there's plenty of points for me here to be able to get at least a respectable win. So Alex moves his army up in turn 1, and why wouldn't he? He's not really afraid of being charged. Lord Croak is putting a little bit of pressure on me with his spell, the Deliverance of Itza, but magically this Lizardman list isn't really that strong. Now in my turn 1, I do start thinking about a little micromanagement on my Knight of the Realm unit. I can see that this is going to be fighting the Gorok-Saurus block, especially because I've got that longbomb charge, so I'm going to get in. So what I decide to do is put my Paladin Gaston on the second rank on the left-hand side of that Knight unit, which he's allowed to do because I've got so many command pieces and characters in that unit. I realise that what I also should have done is tried to get my BSB there onto the third rank, which I could have done if I'd also put my Damsel Marie in that same unit. In other words, 3 paladins all behind each other, which is what I'm going to need in order to direct the maximum number of attacks into Gorok when I come to charge that unit. So I had the right idea, but I didn't quite micromanage it as well as I should have done, and this later had unfortunate consequences. So, in my next turn, I've got really the whole of the sort of Lizardman army here on top of me, and there aren't really any other obvious targets. The Kroxigor have got their flank covered, Alex shifting his unit there with Lord Croak to the side to stop my Grail Knights getting a path in. Good piece of play there, and also the Stegodon is holding back as well, so again, I'm not in much of a position to do much about it. Alex places some skinks in front of the Green Knight, therefore chaffing him. Incidentally, by this moment, it's already very obvious that I'm facing a pretty good player who knows precisely what he's doing. So, I look at the situation as it is presented here. This is my turn 2, or it might be my turn 3, I can't quite recall. Now, the Knights Errant in blue fail their impetuous test. And so really, it's one of those times where I have to decide, am I going to throw the kitchen sink at Alex or not? I can't just hang back and run a unicorn in front of the Saurus block. I'm either going to have to follow those reckless young men in, or just let them perish. And they are not going to be able to blow through a 40-strong, stubborn Saurus unit on their own. They're certainly not going to be able to kill Gorok, even if they can win combat. So I take a deep breath and decide that I've really got to chance my arm, and I charge everything in. I charge my big Knight of the Realm unit into the Saurus block and to try to dispose of Gorok, and because I'm worried about not doing that and the Saurus holding and then being charged in the flank by Lord Croak's unit, I decide to charge Croak's unit with the Grail Knights because I know I'll win combat there and at least that unit won't be in my flank next turn. There might have been an argument for throwing those Grail Knights into the Saurus block as well and just hoping I kill Gorok and then overrunning with the whole damn army. Maybe taking the Stegodon charge but getting out of the way of Lord Croak. I should say also that I pulled that unicorn in front of the Stegodon up too far and Alex was able to just shoot it off, so I had no real available piece of chaff unless I'd used Marie out of the Grail Knight unit, in which case they wouldn't have been able to charge. So, anyone looking at this position who was just passing a table would think the Bretonnians have absolutely got this. I've got all 3 Knight units there charged in. In the magic phase, I also managed to get the boosted harmonic convergence off on them, which gives all of them the reroll 1s to hit wound and armor save. There's an absolute train of firepower going into these infantry blocks. I've got probably the best chance I'm going to have to dispose of them, but I know that I'm not going to break the Croak unit and I've got to kill Gorok, or they're going to be stubborn leadership 9 with Lizardman and a reroll, and that's not going to end well for me. So, in the combat phase, Alex again very smartly decides to challenge with Gorok. This is an interesting ploy. I can accept with one of my paladins, but really, Gorok is not going to die in this challenge. I would say also that Alex has got Wissen's Wild Form on this unit as well, so Gorok is up to toughness 7. That's still not by any means an impossibility with my strength 6 knights on the charge though. Anyway, so what I decide to do after some consideration is decline the challenge, and thus both the Knights of the Realm and the Knights Errant lose the blessing. I maintain that this was absolutely the right thing to do because it's the only chance I would have had of killing Gorok. Alex, of course, is then allowed to retire one of my paladins to the back rank, which means a single paladin and the Knights of the Realm on one side are all swinging in to Gorok. This, in the combat phase, does not fall in my favour. The Paladin completely whiffs his attacks, even with harmonic convergence. The Knights of the Realm damage Gorok, but only do 1 wound, so he's still alive there on 1 wound. That unit now is probably not going anywhere. The rest of my Knights of the Realm and my Knights Errant fight very respectably and kill, probably getting on for 14 or 15 of the Saurus. They lose loads in reply though. Really, despite having harmonic convergence, I really roll like absolute garbage for my armor saves. Even though this is just regular Saurus, I managed to lose no less than half of the Knights Errant unit just from, some sort of strength 5 infantry replies, which is a bit disappointing. So I'm not in a good way there, having really blown my main charge. Now my Grail Knights, I'm expecting, better things from, even with -1 to hit. With harmonic convergence, this unit, with 9 of them in previous games, does so much damage. But in the end, all they really managed to do is kill around 6 of the Temple Guard. Really didn't roll well at all. And the Croak unit there isn't going anywhere either. Now there's a Stegodon standing there as well to add to my pains. I decide to reform my Grail Knights so that at least the Stegodon is going to be charging them in the front. I'm going to need some luck there with its impact hits. If it only kills 1 Grail Knight, I might have a reasonable chance of managing to continue to fight on against those Temple Guard. Because Grail Knights, they can grind a bit, especially with harmonic convergence. Now in Alex's turn, the combats continue to go poorly for me. Fairly obviously, I haven't charged. The Grail Knights in particular have an absolutely horrendous time against the Temple Guard and the Stegodon. The Stegodon gets, I believe, a 5 on its impact hits. I again completely roll like garbage for my armor saves, and the Grail Knights get slaughtered, break, and get run down despite having swift stride. I should also say that the Stegodon actually had an overrun into the flank of the Knights of the Realm unit, which my opponent was very aware of, and he didn't quite get enough to connect with that overrun, which would have put the Stegodon in combat with the Knights of the Realm as well, which would have been an absolute disaster for me. So that was a little bit of luck, I guess, for me there. On the combat against the Knights Errant and the Knights of the Realm, the Saurus fight a lot less well this time. I do kill a few Saurus myself and actually manage to do fairly respectably, and both of those units manage to stick, although I do lose my BSB Pierre in the struggle. In my final turn, Bretonnian turn 4, which is what this ended up being, my trebuchets, which have not done well throughout the whole game, keep firing at that Stegodon. They hit it for the second time in the game, but still can't bring it down. Finally, my Pegasus rider, Jacques, manages to charge one of the skink blocks at the back, which has 2 shaman in it, and I manage to run them down to actually score the only points that I did in the game. Now, this game overall was quite a cagey affair. Not a lot of things died in it. My Grail Knights died, and so did my BSB, and I really managed to kill a unit of skinks with a couple of shaman in. This is a 12-8 loss overall. So, a really hard matchup, no question about this. 2 infantry blocks that I could do very little about. I think I had the right idea there with Gorok. If I'd have micromanaged those paladins a little bit more, 1 more paladin swinging into Gorok, even with the decline challenges, I think I could have killed him. And then I would have broken those Saurus and broken through with my knight units, and probably been in a position to help out with the Grail Knights as well later. So a really good game. Alex played extremely well in terms of neutralising my threats and, taking advantage of, the advantage that he knew he had with the matchup, which was obviously these stubborn and these unbreakable units. He also contained the Green Knight very well. I wasn't able to dick around with his Stegodon, and he also didn't allow the unicorns to get in his way. This was a dramatic, red-blooded game of competitive fantasy, played in excellent spirit, but nonetheless with lots of gasping, banging of the table, at least on my part anyway, and literally made me feel drenched with sweat at the end because of the number of crucial moments there were in the game. Most of them did go against me, but some of them did go for me, and my two main night blocks weren't broken by the Saurus at the end, allowing me to hang on by my fingernails for a skinny loss. An excellent game of fantasy though, well worth coming to the tournament for on its own. So, at the end of day 3, I've got 39 points out of 60 from my 3 games. Very respectable, but not really enough to have me challenging the top 3, unless, of course, I get 2 heavy wins the next day. So, very much all to play for, and I wake up the next morning optimistic that I think I can still do well and have a tilt at the top brass. So, on to game 4, and it's Lizardmen again. My opponent here is Will Quick, not an opponent I've faced before, although I have seen him about at prior tournaments. So, when I see this Lizardmen list going down, I'm already getting pessimistic again. He's got 3 Stegodons. Now, 1 Stegodon's okay, but 3 of them's difficult because they're all stubborn and there's not really a guarantee that you're going to be able to blow through them on the charge as Bretonnains. All 3 of them, if he uses them well and uses them to cover each other, I might be in some difficulty here. But more than the Stegodons, he's got 2 massive infantry blocks, and my heart sinks when I see the size of his Temple Guard unit. It's nearly 40 strong. That's a stubborn leadership 9 with a reroll unit there that I'm going to have to shift also to be able to win the mission that applies for this game, which is the Blood and Glory Fortitude based mission. Essentially, you have to get the opposing army to breaking point by destroying their standards, their BSB or their general. Both of our armies have only got 5 fortitude, which is not that high, so you've got to kill 2 to make it count. So what Will does very smartly is he places his BSB and his general inside the Temple Guard unit. That's got 4 points of his fortitude in. If I'm going to get the mission and that 500 VPs, I'm going to have to destroy this nearly 40 strong stubborn unit in a game where there are 3 Stegodons and lots of skinks marching about. Going to be very hard for me to do this, especially if he's not aggressive with it. For me, I don't really have the same kind of option to sort of pack 1 unit with all my fortitude because my general is on foot. So the units go down like this, and my opponent does indeed place his Temple Guard on a hill at the back where it's going to be up to me really to try and force the aggression. And it's going to be really very, very difficult for me to be able, I think, to get the kind of charges on that I'm going to need to have a chance of being able to break it, simply because it's stubborn. I'm not going to be able to hack down that many Temple Guard. Unfortunately, this is sometimes what happens in tournaments. Sometimes there is a hard counter to what you've got, and massive stubborn infantry blocks are the hard counter to Bretonnians. Anyway, I do have some aspiration of being able to destroy his other Saurus block on the left-hand side. That's not stubborn. It's going to be difficult to break its steadfast because you can see how big it is and how many ranks it has, but it's not a foregone conclusion. And I can certainly kill his Stegodons and try and not let him kill much of my stuff. Now, looking at my deployment here, I also realise I've rather misdeployed. I don't understand why I put my unicorns back there. Probably to stop them getting blowpiped off, but never mind. Anyway, in Will's turn 1, he moves up his skinks into the middle of the board. This is just good play, I think, because if I charge them, he's going to simply flee, and skinks have got an excellent chance of rallying, and he's also going to probably be in general range anyway. Now, the one mistake he does make in his movement is that his Stegodon, the red one on the left-hand side, is within the charge arc of my Knights of the Realm, and they, of course, have a long bomb charge. So I should be able to destroy that Stegodon. He also runs a Saurus Old Blood who's just on a cold one, and you can't see him here, but just a single Skink Shaman off onto the left where I've not got much stuff. Now this is a really good ploy, I think, from Will, because those Saurus Old Bloods can be seriously hard customers if they're built in certain ways, you know, 1-up rerollable armor saves and all the rest of it. But I didn't know that actually what he turned out to be was a pretty lightly equipped one, and so I was much more concerned about him than perhaps I otherwise would have been. He was also using his Skink Shaman to cast spells from his Slanwith, threatening my Prophetess's unit, because if he kills my Prophetess, that's 2 fortitude gone. If Chantel dies, he gets the mission. So I think this was really good play to put pressure on me like this. The Skink bombs out spells from the high magic deck, which is what the Slan is running, and I really have to commit my dice to dispelling them, although Chantel's magic resistance does help a lot of the peasant bowmen survive, and Chantel has to beat a bit of a hasty retreat back into my deployment zone to stop any more of that happening. One of the trebuchets finally hits something, and does 4 wounds on one of the Stegodons. That's very helpful. It's those trebuchets, given I've got 2 of the buggers, really should be paying me back sometime soon. On the charge, I'm able to destroy the red Stegodon with my Knights of the Realm, although it's a near-run thing. It takes the horses to finish it off. I'm then in a fairly good place on that side because he's not really able to charge that skink block into me as well, given the way I reform or overrun, I can't remember which. Some of my other units charge some skinks and they flee, but I'm really unable to push up that much because I'm scared of being charged by his Stegodons. His wounded Stegodon does actually charge my Knight of the Realm unit, and fortunately I'm able to ping it off because it's only got a single wound left. That's 2 Stegodons, both of them on the left hand side, down. I then think that really what I've got to do to score some big points in this game is eliminate that Saurus block that's not going to be stubborn. I've got rid of the Stegodons on this side and the skinks are fleeing. I should be able, I hope, to manage that. Now what ends up happening is I use my Grail Knights and also my Knights of the Realm to charge that Saurus block, and the real problem is that I lose a lot of knights going through those wood with dangerous terrain. I believe the Knights of the Realm have lost a couple by this point, and I go in there, I believe, with, including the Paladins, 10 knights, and I lose 4 of them by rolling 4 1s on the dangerous terrain. I get into combat with the Saurus, I do quite a lot of damage, but I am nowhere near close to breaking their steadfast. I can't remember what happened to the Grail Knights, but I don't think the Grail Knights either made their charge or were able to join them. Suffice to say, this was really the sort of closing situation of the game. I was not able to reinforce the Knights of the Realm against the Saurus block, and the Knights of the Realm did not fight well. They, in subsequent turns, were whittled down, and I believe I lost combat by 1 or 2, broke from combat, and once again an infantry unit managed to run down my knights. And with that was really my chances in this game, because that unit contained both a banner and my battle standard bearer, which was enough to break my fortitude. I did manage to mop up the Saurus on the cold one towards the end of the game, and the Skink Shaman, some spells and with my Grail Knights, but these were relatively small potatoes. The game ended up with me having lost the Blood and Glory scenario through my Knights of the Realm unit being destroyed, a 14-6 loss, which probably ended my realistic hopes of coming in the top 3 in this tournament in a pile of broken bones. Oh dear. I think the real problem for me here was simply that I knew I had to take big risks if I was going to be competitive in the tournament, and I faced an extremely difficult matchup because well over half of the army's points, I think, or maybe probably about that, were bound up in a unit that there was nothing I could really do anything about, and I wasn't going to be able to make the mission either. So I was going to have to go hard on to try and destroy everything else, and that's what I tried to do. and I was able to destroy the 2 Stegodons and clear out the chaff, but I wasn't in a position to really get the kind of charge I needed on the Saurus block. I needed 2 Knight Wedges in there, and my opponent played quite well using his chaff and didn't really give me the chance I needed there. And in a game that's only 4 turns long, you've got to sometimes punt for those off chances, and they didn't work out for me here. Anyway, that's sometimes just how it goes, and if you're playing Bretonnians, then there are these hard counters about. I did feel a little bit aggrieved that I'd faced large, stubborn or unbreakable infantry blocks in 3 out of my 4 games. Now, they are of course part of the meta of 8th edition, but I wouldn't expect to face them anything like as regularly as that. Perhaps once in 4 games would be what I might be expecting, not 3. Anyway, so this probably pushed me down to really around the sort of middle tables for my final game. And as often happens in the closing stages of these sorts of tournaments, players who know that they're, not in a position to be competitive for the higher ranks can just have a really fun, relaxing game. And this was, in some respects, what I got, but also in some respects not what I got, because my last game in this tournament was actually my favourite one. Now, this was against Tim Richardson, who was playing an Empire army. Empire, perfectly reasonable matchup for Bretonnia most of the time. Their infantry blocks, absolutely, we can charge off, not that bothered about the cavalry, and we've got some fairly good hard counters to the war machines, in particular the steam tank, which the Green Knight can have no end of fun with. But, Tim had Balthazar Gelt, the incarnate of metal, which is probably about the worst thing Bretonnians can possibly face. Even worse than a huge stubborn infantry block. By the way, he had a huge stubborn infantry block as well, about 40 greatswords. So, Gelt. Well, for those of you who've not faced him, he's an end times character. He's a lawmaster on metal, which obviously is fantastic against Bretonnians because they're an armor save 2+ knight army. And he's also got a really interesting spell. I'm being a bit politically correct when I call it interesting. So what it does is it's a bound item, but if he casts it, D3 units from his army vanish into the ether. They can then reappear in the start of his next turn and charge. That might be one of the most single game-breaking things I think I've ever seen in any edition of Warhammer Fantasy. It's absolutely insane. So if he casts that spell, it's probably game over. So I'm going to need to make sure I stop it. Of course though, what this means is saving all your power dice for that, while Balthazar Gelt with his +7 to cast on the Law of Metal toasts your knights. So given how hard I thought this matchup was, I knew that the only thing I really could do here to have a chance was kill Gelt, and that ain't easy, because he's got 6 wounds. He's got a 3-up ward save versus missiles and a 2-up ward save versus magic. How the fuck are you going to kill this guy? It's pretty bloody difficult. So, on Tim's turn 1, he uses Gelt, as you would expect, aggressively. Knowing that I'm saving up my dice to stop this transportation spell, Gelt sets about throwing the knights into the blacksmith's furnace. His first spell is a final transmutation on the Knight's Errant unit that I put a couple of characters in because they're in a better position. That wipes out about half of the Knight's Errant, although my characters do survive. On the left-hand side, I make a silly mistake with my mounted yeomen. I choose not to vanguard them, which allows Tim to vanguard his outriders. His outriders can't, of course, move and shoot. That's one of their major disabilities. And because he gets turn 1, because Bretonnians always get the second turn, he's able to shoot off Jacques immediately with those outriders. That's poor play from me, because Jacques could have been really quite useful there, either in killing the outriders himself or trying to get to the side of one of those infantry blocks and using his worm lance to roast some of them. Anyway, so come my turn 1, I know that I'm in a bit of a pickle. I've already lost quite a lot of stuff, and that Gelt, there aren't going to be too many more knights around in subsequent magic phases. So I decide to go pretty hell for leather and move up my knights quite aggressively. I have half of a plan, which is that if I can get a charge on that greatsword unit, and it fails its stubborn test, because of course, yes, it's another generically stubborn unit of the kind I've already faced in 3 games before, again, I can overrun into Gelt and destroy him. This, I think, is my best chance. Now, I don't really continue that philosophy as consistently as I should do in my shooting phase, because if I was going to do that, I think I should have been pounding the infantry blocks with my trebuchets. Instead, I go for Gelt, and I do hit him with 1 trebuchet, but he passes his ward save. There's not a lot of point really shooting artillery at Gelt. He's got a 3-up ward save, and even if you get him, he's got 6 wounds, so realistically you're going to have to get 2 rocks through on him. So, in Tim's next turn, he actually has, I think, a fairly ineffective magic phase, and Gelt doesn't really do the kind of damage you would expect him to. I know he threw out a Searing Doom at my Green Knight. My Green Knight was able to pass all his ward saves, I believe, and stop himself being killed. My Unicorn dicks about with the Steam Tank and railroads it. The Steam Tank also misfired, I should say. Tim also misfired with his cannon, which blew itself up. And I find myself in a position where I've really got to decide to charge or just get fried. Now, I've of course got a long bomb charge with virtue of the Impetuous Knight, and so I decide to let the Great Swords have it. Try to hope that I break them with Gelt's Leadership 9 Stubborn and overrun into him. Now, what I managed to do in the magic phase is I managed to get an Ice Shard Blizzard off on Gelt, which lowers his leadership by 1. Now he's only got leadership 8. There's still a chance if I go into the Greatswords and I kill the BSB on the charge that I'm going to be making Tim test on a leadership 8 flat. And you know, he might fail that. And if he does, his Greatswords are going to die and I'm going to get into combat with Gelt and kill the bastard. Anyway, come the combat phase, my knights really roll well. They kill the BSB despite him having armour of meteoric iron and kill loads of greatswords. I win combat by a ton. Tim, with dramatic effect, rolls the dice 1 by 1. They come up a 5. So sadly, I've not broken the greatswords. In Tim's turn, his halberdiers charge into the side of my Knights of the Realm unit. This was, of course, always a problem. The halberdiers were hit by a trebuchet, where I killed something in the region of 18 of them, a superb treb hit, but the halberdiers wheel into the side, and then the magic begins. Gelt, of course, not just is about blasting knights, he's got some great little buffs on the Lore of Metal. First, he gives the greatswords a 2-up armour save with glittering robes. Then he gets enchanted blades off on the halberdiers, giving them +1 to wound and armour piercing. Tim has also managed by this point to cast 2 instances of Plague of Rust on my Knights of the Realm. So pretty much my Knights of the Realm are now more or less as naked as the day they were born. They've really got very little armour left indeed. Now, against this monstrous charge, I get very, very lucky. Tim doesn't roll very well. I lose a lot of Knights of the Realm, although I still kill quite a few of him as well. I think I have Harmonic Convergence off at this point, and I need a 3 to stick, and I get it. Pretty disgraceful. In my next turn, the Grau Knights are able to complete a charge on the Halberdiers, who have killed enough knights for their own front to be exposed, and I feel pretty confident I can cut down all those Halberdiers and win combat massively. The problem is that my more or less naked Knights of the Realm, with 3 characters in them, are going to be butchered by the great swords with all those buffs on them. Now, what happens in the combat phase is absolutely the Grau Knights essentially impale, I think, 20 halberdiers. I get a big harmonic convergence off on a double 6, and so also my Knights of the Realm are re-rolling their armour saves. I get so lucky with my armour saves. I managed to roll, I believe, a 6 to save my BSB, and Tim is only able to defeat 1 of my Paladins. And with obviously the big advantage in combat resolution, I win this fight. But the greatswords once again stick on their stubborn leadership. And unfortunately, this fascinating game there had to be called because the round time limit was at an end. This was overall a 10-10 draw. Now I think I'm quite flattered by that. Sure, I would have killed the greatswords in time, but I think that Tim would have killed all of that Knight of the Realm unit, maybe using his cavalry unit there on the flank, which had actually overrun off the table there when it destroyed that white errant unit that I placed in front of it. This was a really thrilling game, and it was played in a competitive yet extremely sporting kind of manner. For example, you can see here that Tim's knights look as though they might just be able to fit through that gap there between the white knights and the red knights. It was really touch and go, and in the end he decided to say that they couldn't. Really fantastic sportsmanship. I was able to repay that sportsmanship later when Tim did a combat reform on his greatswords, which would have opened up Gelt to a charge from the Grail Knights. But I really liked the way in which this game was played. As I say, it was competitive, but at the same time also very sporting as well. And Tim also helped make the game enjoyable by the force of his humour, by the force of his charisma, and amplifying the stories of heroism or indeed incompetence that are part and parcel of a game in a sometimes humorous fantasy world rather than the grim, dark future of unrelenting war. A thoroughly enjoyable game. So, some closing thoughts. Needless to say, I had a thoroughly enjoyable time at the Triple Crown and really enjoyed the games and the company that were provided by my 5 opponents, and indeed everyone else at the tournament as well. Now, from a competitive standpoint, this was pretty disappointing. I came 15th out of, I believe, 36 or 40 players, which for a player of my level of experience, and given how well I've done in the past, is a bit disappointing. I do think I was not just unlucky, but exceptionally unlucky, not with the dice I threw, I don't think there was anything really wrong with those, but by the matchups that I faced. 4 of them were absolute nightmare matchups. A dwarf list that was castling with the Master Rune of Groth One Eye, very difficult to win big against in a necessarily short game, and then 3 other games with big stubborn infantry blocks. Now I think the Empire Greatswords would not normally be such a problem, but of course they were also in a list that featured the Lore Master of Metal, Balthazar Geld. The 2 really difficult lists though were I think the 2 Lizardmen lists. They were very difficult, and if you are a Bretonnian, there's not really very much you can do about big generically stubborn infantry blocks. You can try and break their steadfast, of course, and there are lots of strategies for doing that, but there are a lot of things in the Warhammer world, too many, is my opinion, that are generically stubborn, and Bretonnians can't do a lot about that. You can, of course, pound those blocks with trebuchets, with magic, and then try and charge them, but that does require time, and realistically, if you're going to blow through your opponent in 4 turns to get a big win, you're not really going to have enough time to be able to do that, so you're going to have to take some risks. I should say that when I played with my Bretonnians in the tournament in Cardiff, I only had 1 of these really difficult kind of matchups in 5 games. So that's how it goes sometimes. You have to, if you are playing with Bretonnians, just be philosophical about it. There are a lot of things in the Warhammer Fantasy universe which are horrible for your army. If I'm playing something like Chaos, I think most of the time I've got a very good chance. There aren't really that many armies that I feel are a hard matchup for me. Whereas with Bretonnians, they're obviously significantly more common. But that's part and parcel of the challenge of playing with a hard army. It's not as though I didn't know I was getting what I paid for. So in terms of the actual army itself, well, within the confines of some pretty difficult matchups, I think the army did okay. I think Chantal, my prophetess, even though in these general summaries of games I haven't said very much about, was fantastic on her Heaven's Magic. I got some great harmonic convergences, even if they didn't really end up coming, off, or didn't end up making the difference for me. Ishar Blizzard was fantastic, and she really put lots of pressure upon her opponent. My other characters, the Green Knight didn't have a great time of things, I don't think. He did appear in all of the games, which was nice, but he sort of got lost, I think, in some of these combats, because the Green Knight excels when it comes to tying up individual pieces. And I did face Stegodons, I did face steam tanks, but I didn't manage to get the Green Knight into positions where he could be that effectual. And I think the Green Knight is better in 6-turn games than he is in shorter games. He's got more chances to appear, to come back to life if he dies, and, you know, generally to exert influence. I don't believe the Green Knight actually died in this tournament. He did actually die in the 4th game, I believe, but I managed to bring him back to life. So he did okay, but he didn't really do the kind of damage that he did in the past. As for my heroes, my Beast Wizard Marie, she did a few things, but because I had so many nice cheap spells with Chantel, most of the time I didn't really use Marie. I like having a level 2 wizard, I really like the model as well, so I'm loath to drop her and just only go in with Chantel, but she didn't really pull her weight. As for the Paladins, well, they did fine, but I wasn't really able to use them in the very creative way. For example, I used them against Mark's army, or maybe in the first game against Terror, where I was able to break them out of units and do stuff with them. Really, this was because the main problem in the other games were big stubborn infantry blocks, and no number of little paladins darting about the place is going to help you that much against that. I do think, had I micromanaged them better in the game against Alex, I would have had a chance there of killing Gorok. But I think that the rationale of having a wall of 1-up reroll or armor save characters is to hold on to your ranks to break the opponent's steadfast. Steadfast wasn't a problem for me in this tournament, it was generic stubborn, and so that kind of ploy, didn't really work. But on another day, against other armies, against other opponents, perhaps it would have done. And then the actual guys themselves, the Knights of the Realm did quite a lot of fighting, generally did well. The Grey Knights, except for in the last game, were I think probably my unluckiest unit. They got taken out by shooting, I believe they were run down a couple of times by infantry blocks. They didn't do that well. My Knights Errant were not very reliable. They failed several impetuous tests. Admittedly, yeah, look, it's on a 6 rerollable, so that is going to happen quite a lot. Showed me the downsides of the Arenti banner. The Unicorns were incredibly useful. Perhaps I could have used them better and they'd have been even more useful. And the Trebuchets, they got a few good hits in, but for 2 Trebs, I don't think that was really a great performance, quite frankly. So the army didn't do quite as well as I think it has done in the past, but I think a lot of this was the matchups. I think had I done that again and had different opponents that I'd faced, I think this army might have done quite well. So 5 games isn't really enough to really say too much about it, really. And after all, with Bretonnia, it's not as though you can go and change your list and use other things. There are only a limited number of options, and you have to just use what you have better. And I can think of a few ways that I would use it better. But some of it, of course, is just accepting that it's a hard army to use, and you will get bad matchups, and if you're unlucky, you're going to get quite a lot of bad matchups. Anyway, a thoroughly enjoyable time, and I'm looking forward to trying out my Bretonnians again in competitive play in around a month's time at the tournament in Cardiff, where I'll pick a slightly different list, but it will be largely similar, and we'll see how it goes about things then. Anyway, part of being frustrated with this game is because it makes you care, and that's one of the brilliant things about Warhammer Fantasy. And I know that, maybe even years later, some of my opponents will probably remember some of the things that happened in these games. I certainly will. It's a wonderful opportunity not just to play a really fun game with dice and to meet some smashing people, but to forge your own collective memories, tell your own stories about the kind of heroism and of course good and bad dice that take place on a gaming table, a place where all manner of amazing things can happen. So, Chantal's travelling back across Bretonnia to give her report to the king. Mixed news, I'm afraid, Your Majesty. Our knights killed a lot of them, but somehow, even when they did, they just wouldn't run away. About 20 years ago, when a book was written about our army, that sort of thing didn't used to happen very much, did it? Chantal can, of course, be very persuasive. Thank you very much for listening, and good night.